Imagine spending your entire life building an empire, creating a fortune that stretches across generations. That's Edward Blackwell, a 75-year-old millionaire whose name is practically synonymous with success. He sits in his grand estate, Oakwood Manor, a mansion so large it seems to echo with the silence of his solitude. The halls, once filled with laughter and the bustle of family, now stand empty, save for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock. His sprawling gardens are meticulously maintained, but no one comes to enjoy them with him anymore. Edward, alone in his golden years, begins to feel the weight of what he's built. His children Elizabeth, Michael, Christopher, Sarah, and Thomas are scattered across the country, each too caught up in their own busy lives to visit him. The calls they make on holidays are short, emotionless. It's clear his children don't care about him. They only care about what he can give them. Wealth, status, luxury. The riches he's provided them have strained their bonds, leaving Edward feeling isolated and forgotten. Even though Oakwood Manor is filled with expensive furniture, antiques, and the trappings of wealth, the one thing it lacks is warmth. Edward's mind wanders to the past. Memories of his late wife, Madeline, who used to fill these rooms with love and laughter. She's been gone for over a decade, and with her passing, so too did the heart of the family. Now, all he has is his fortune, a fortune that has done little to ease the aching loneliness he feels deep in his chest. In the quiet of his estate, Edward realizes something. The wealth that was supposed to bring him joy has become nothing more than a prison, a cage that has kept him from true connection. And as he sits there, reflecting on his life, he can't help but wonder, how did it all go wrong? What happened to the family he once had? What happened to the love that should have filled these grand halls? Just when Edward thought his days of companionship were over, a ray of hope enters his life in the form of Addison Parker, a young and energetic physiotherapist. She's hired to help Edward with his increasing mobility issues, but from the moment she steps into Oakwood Manor, it feels like a breath of fresh air. Addison is kind, attentive, and filled with an enthusiasm that Edward hasn't experienced in years. Their therapy sessions become more than just physical treatment. They're filled with conversations, laughter, and the joy of reminiscing about the past. For the first time in a long time, Edward feels seen, like there's someone who genuinely cares about him, not for his wealth, but for him as a person. As the days go on, Addison's presence becomes a constant in Edward's life. Her bright smile and warm energy bring a much-needed spark to the empty halls of Oakwood Manor. They share stories, her tales of starting out as a young professional, and his memories of building the family fortune and the love he shared with Madeline. It's a companionship Edward never expected but now finds himself craving. But as the weeks pass, something starts to change. Addison's behavior begins to shift subtly. She starts asking more questions about Edward's finances. Curious, probing questions about his investments, his estate, and the future of his wealth. First, Edward brushes it off, thinking she's just being kind, offering advice from a place of concern. But the more they talk, the more he begins to feel uneasy. Addison, who once seemed so genuine, now starts to hint at how she could help him manage his wealth, suggesting that she's been well-versed in handling large estates. Edward's suspicions begin to grow. Was it truly his well-being she cared about? Or was it something else? The same thing that had driven his children away? His fortune. The question lingers in Edward's mind. Could this young woman, who had so quickly become his companion, be just another opportunist? Or was he simply paranoid in his old age? Only time would tell, but one thing was certain. His world was about to change in ways he couldn't yet foresee. As Edward sat in the quiet of Oakwood Manor, surrounded by the trappings of his life, his fortune, his estate, his legacy, a harsh realization struck him like a cold wave. All these years, he had provided everything for his children: luxury, education, opportunities. But had he ever truly given them what mattered most? Real love, real connection. His mind wandered to the countless missed birthdays, the empty visits, The rare phone calls from his children that felt more like obligatory check-ins than genuine moments of care. He wondered if they even saw him anymore, or if all they saw was the wealth he had created. It was then that Edward made a decision that would change everything. He would test them. He would put them to the test to see if they truly cared about him or if, like so many before them, they were only interested in what he could give them. His plan was simple yet bold. He would pretend that his wealth, the very thing that had both sustained and isolated him, was slipping away. The rumors of financial ruin would spread, and soon enough, his children would have to face the uncomfortable truth. Edward began to sow the seeds of his grand scheme. First, he spoke with his lawyer, instructed the household staff to scale back, and let the whispers of his dwindling finances begin to circulate. He made sure his children heard the talk, carefully planting doubts in their minds. Oakwood Manor, once a symbol of unassailable wealth, was now a house burdened with mounting debts. The estate, the Blackwell legacy, was in jeopardy. With each passing day, Edward observed his children's reactions, eager to see who would rush to his side out of genuine concern, and who would view his supposed financial woes as an opportunity to claim their stake in what was left. The calls became more frequent, the words more concerned. But Edward wasn't fooled. Behind the hollow promises of help, the anxious chatter about restructuring investments, and the calculated offers to assist lay the stark truth. His children had been far more concerned with their inheritance than with the man who had given them everything. The grand scheme had begun, and Edward watched, a quiet observer, as the truth about his family slowly began to reveal itself. Would they surprise him? Or would they reveal themselves as nothing more than opportunistic vultures, circling the prospect of a dwindling fortune? Time would tell, but Edward was ready to learn the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The day had finally arrived. Edward Blackwell, standing at the helm of his grand estate, Oakwood Manor, felt the weight of the moment settle in. The mansion, which had long been a symbol of both his success and his isolation, was about to become the stage for a grand performance, one that would reveal the true nature of his family. The invitations had been sent out under the pretense of a farewell gathering before the sale of the estate. His children, his close associates, and a few old friends would arrive, each of them expecting one thing: to say goodbye to the legacy of the Blackwell fortune. But what they didn't know was that the farewell wasn't just about the manor. It was about the inheritance, the wealth, and their true feelings towards Edward himself. As the guests began to arrive, Edward watched from the shadows, his keen eyes noting every subtle shift in their demeanor. His children, all now adults with their own lives and ambitions, gathered in the grand foyer, eager to see how much of the Blackwell legacy was left for them to claim. The moment they were all in one place, the tension in the room was palpable. Elizabeth, the eldest, was the first to approach him. Her smile was polite, but there was a calculating look in her eyes as she asked, "Dad, are you sure you're ready to let go of everything? This estate. It's been in the family for generations." But Edward could hear the unspoken words. What about the inheritance? Lurking beneath her concern. It was clear that, for Elizabeth, Oakwood Manor was nothing more than a valuable asset, and her first concern was whether it would remain intact enough to secure her future. Next, Michael and Christopher, the successful twins, breezed into the room, their greetings perfunctory at best. Michael, the surgeon, and Christopher, the tech mogul, shared a brief handshake with Edward before exchanging glances, their indifference to the situation glaringly obvious. They were here out of obligation, not affection. Their thoughts, no doubt, were focused on the value of Oakwood Manor, not on the man who had spent years building the fortune they so eagerly expected to inherit. Sarah, the artist, was no better. She seemed more concerned with how the sale of the manor would affect her monthly allowance than with the emotional impact of losing the home where she had grown up. As she fidgeted with the hem of her designer dress, she made a comment about the lack of fresh flowers in the house. Her words were not a complaint, but rather a critique of how the manor's grandeur had been slowly stripped away. She had no interest in reconnecting with her father. Her focus was entirely on how the situation would impact her lifestyle. And then there was Thomas, the youngest, the one Edward had once considered his financial heir. But Thomas's reaction was more troubling than any of the others. Rather than express concern for his father's well-being, Thomas immediately began to ask questions about the details of the financial collapse. His focus was entirely on salvaging what he could from the supposed losses. How could they restructure the estate? Were there any investments that could be liquidated for a quick profit? His mind, once sharp and driven by ambition, now seemed more consumed by numbers than by his own flesh and blood. As Edward watched his children react, one by one, it became painfully clear the loyalty and love he had once hoped to see from them had been replaced by greed, apathy, and self-interest. This grand gathering, meant to be a celebration of family and legacy, had instead revealed the cold reality. His children didn't care about him, they cared about what he could give them. And in this moment, as the truth came to light, Edward realized that his plan had succeeded in exposing the harsh truth. His children had failed the test of loyalty and love. They hadn't come to say goodbye to the man who had built their world. They had come to claim what they could before it slipped away. As the gathering continued to unfold, a palpable sense of discomfort settled in the air. The family's true intentions were now laid bare, and the murmur of voices grew louder, filled with whispered judgments and subtle accusations. But amid all the family drama, there was one person who had been quietly observing from the sidelines. Addison Parker, the young physiotherapist who had recently entered Edward's life. First, Addison had been a breath of fresh air. Her youthful energy and caring nature had seemed to offer Edward the companionship he so desperately needed in his twilight years. She had brought light into his isolated world, and for a time, Edward had allowed himself to believe that there was genuine concern in her presence. But the more time they spent together, the more Edward began to notice something strange. Addison's interest in his health was no longer her sole focus. Slowly, she started to shift the conversation towards his finances, making veiled suggestions about how she could help him manage his wealth. The kind and helpful physiotherapist had become the savvy manipulator, testing the waters to see if she could worm her way into Edward's will. As the evening progressed, it became clear to Edward that Addison's motives were far from pure. The casual questions about his wealth, the subtle hints that she could be the one to manage his estate in his declining years, it was all starting to add up. Edward had heard these tactics before, especially from his own children, but from someone like Addison, who he had thought of as a friend, it stung even more. The final straw came when Addison, sensing an opportunity, began to press him more directly. "Mr. Blackwell," she said with that all-too-familiar sweetness, "I know you're going through a lot right now, but I really believe that we could do something wonderful together. I could help you with everything, your finances, your health. You don't have to go through this alone." In that moment, Edward knew exactly what she was trying to do. She saw him as an easy target, an old man who might be desperate enough to let her into his life and his will. A wave of realization swept over him, and it was then that Edward made a decision. He wasn't going to let Addison use him. He wasn't going to let her get away with this. With his mind made up, Edward quietly excused himself from the gathering, making his way to his study, where he had something waiting. When Addison followed him shortly after, Edward didn't mince words. "Miss Parker," he said with a cold edge to his voice, "I know exactly what you're up to." Addison's face faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered, her practiced smile returning. "What do you mean, Mr. Blackwell?" she asked, her voice dripping with feigned innocence. Without a word, Edward reached into a drawer and pulled out a small box. "This," he said, holding it up in front of her, "contains everything." He handed the box to Addison, and when she opened it, her face went white. Inside, she found a USB drive, one that contained recordings of every conversation they had ever had. Every moment, every subtle hint she had dropped about his fortune, every attempt to manipulate him for her own gain. Edward had been recording her, and now he had the evidence he needed to expose her greed. Addison's facade crumbled instantly. Her eyes widened in shock, and she stammered, You've been recording me?" Edward's voice was unwavering as he spoke. "Yes, Miss Parker. I've known what you've been up to from the start. You may have thought you could exploit my loneliness, but I'm not that naive." Addison tried to backpedal, her voice shaking with desperation. I never meant it like that. I care about you, Mr. Blackwell. I just wanted to help you, to be there for you." But her words rang hollow, and Edward wasn't fooled. "You used my vulnerability to try and secure your future, Addison," he said, his tone as sharp as a blade. "And I'm not going to let you get away with it. Take the drive, and leave. Don't ever come near me again." He turned his back on her, signaling that their interaction was over. Addison stood there for a moment, trembling with rage and humiliation, before she turned and fled, her footsteps echoing through the hallway. As the door slammed shut behind her, Edward let out a long, slow breath. He had made his point, and Addison had learned a hard lesson that day, one that no amount of manipulation or charm could ever undo. For Edward, it was a victory, but it was also a painful reminder that the world he had built, a world of wealth and power, had always attracted those with less than pure motives. As he returned to the gathering, Edward felt a sense of clarity settle over him. He had rid himself of Addison, just as he had seen through the selfishness of his own children. Now, the true challenge lay ahead. How to rebuild the relationships that mattered, how to show his family the true meaning of wealth, and how to leave a legacy of integrity, not one of money. But for now, at least, he had taken the first step. He had removed the parasites from his life, and that alone felt like a small victory. After Addison's departure, Edward felt an overwhelming sense of clarity and peace. The chaos, the manipulation, the greed, it all seemed to dissipate, leaving him alone with his thoughts. For the first time in a long while, he found himself contemplating his legacy, not the wealth he had accumulated, not the grand estate he had built, but the lessons he had failed to impart on those he loved. The realization was striking, even to someone as wise as Edward. The greatest inheritance he could leave behind was not his fortune, but the values that shaped him and the lessons he had learned over the years. The more Edward thought about it, the more convinced he became that he had spent his entire life building something that, in the end, would not matter. His wealth, while it had afforded his family comfort and opportunity, had also created a chasm between them, a wall that had distanced them from each other. His children, consumed by ambition and greed, had forgotten what truly mattered. What they needed, more than anything, was a wake-up call, something that would force them to reckon with the values that had been lost along the way. It was then that Edward made a final, life-altering decision. He would establish a trust, not for his children, but for charitable causes. The money that had once been a source of contention and division would no longer be accessible for personal gain. Instead, it would go toward supporting causes that aligned with the values he had once shared with his late wife, Madeline: compassion, integrity, and community. The funds would be used to promote education, help those in need, and create opportunities for those less fortunate, teaching his children that wealth could be used for something far greater than just material accumulation. As word of Edward's decision spread, something unexpected began to happen. Over the next few weeks, his children, who had once been distant and preoccupied with their own lives, began to reach out to him. One by one, they sought him out. Elizabeth, Michael, Christopher, Sarah, each with a different approach, but all driven by the same desire to make amends. Elizabeth, the eldest, was the first to come to him. She arrived at Oakwood Manor one quiet afternoon, her expression softened with regret. "Dad," she said, sitting down beside him, "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about how I've treated you over the years. I focused so much on my career, on building my own legacy, that I forgot about the family legacy. I forgot about you and Mom." I'm sorry. Edward listened quietly, his heart heavy with a mixture of disappointment and hope. He had longed for this moment, for one of his children to recognize the truth of their relationship, to understand that love and family mattered more than wealth. Elizabeth's words were a start, a small but significant step toward reconciliation. Over the next few days, Michael and Christopher came to him, their usual bravado replaced with a humility that Edward had never seen before. "Dad," Michael said, his voice uncharacteristically soft, "we've been idiots. All we've ever thought about is the money. But we're wrong. We want to use what we've been given to make a difference, not just for ourselves but for others." Christopher nodded in agreement. "We've been so focused on competing with each other, on what we could get out of this family, that we never stopped to think about what we could give." The sincerity in their voices was undeniable, and for the first time in years, Edward allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could change. The lesson he had set in motion with his will was beginning to take root in their hearts. Then came Sarah, his most artistic child, the one who had distanced herself the most. Her eyes, filled with tears, reflected the weight of her own realizations. "I've been running away from you," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought you and Mom never understood me, never supported my passion for art. But I was wrong. You always did. I want to use what you've given me to make a difference, to help others see the beauty in creativity and art, just like you saw in me." For the first time, Edward saw his children not as distant strangers but as individuals who had finally understood the true meaning of family. Their regrets were painful to witness, but they were also the key to healing the broken relationships that had defined so much of his life. And so, as the weeks passed, Edward began to see glimpses of the family he had longed for. His children were not perfect, far from it, but they were willing to change. They were starting to understand that real wealth was not about the inheritance they stood to gain, but about the connections they had with each other, with the world around them, and with the values that truly mattered. In this process, Edward found a sense of fulfillment that he had never expected. It was not the fortune he had accumulated over the years, nor the legacy of Oakwood Manor, but the legacy of love, of second chances, of redemption. It was a legacy built not on what he could give them in material wealth, but on what they could give back to the world, in service to others and in the rebuilding of their fractured family. For Edward Blackwell, this was the greatest victory of all, the realization that, after all the years of building, the most valuable thing he had to leave behind was not his fortune, but the lessons he had imparted, the wisdom he had shared, and the hope that, even in his twilight years, he could still shape the future for the better. The transformation of Oakwood Manor was nothing short of a miracle. Once an imposing symbol of wealth and status, it had now become a beacon of hope, compassion, and opportunity. Edward Blackwell had always known the potential of the sprawling estate, but it was only now, in the twilight of his years, that he was truly able to realize its greater purpose. Oakwood Manor had been turned into a thriving community center dedicated to underprivileged youth. William and Alexa, both deeply committed to carrying forward Edward's vision, spearheaded the project. Together, they worked tirelessly to create a place where children from all walks of life could come to learn, grow, and dream. They had transformed the estate into a hub for educational workshops, arts programs, and even sports leagues, offering young people not just shelter, but the tools they needed to build brighter futures. For Edward, the project marked the culmination of everything he had longed for. He could see, in the smiles of the children who played on the lawns and attended classes in the newly renovated rooms, that his true legacy was taking shape. His wealth and property had been a blessing, but they had also created walls that had distanced him from the very people he had hoped to love. Now, those walls were being torn down, brick by brick, as the estate became a place of connection, purpose, and generosity. The money, once so important, had taken a backseat to the love and shared mission of helping others. Edward sat in the garden of Oakwood Manor one quiet evening, looking out over the transformed grounds. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the vast lawns. He felt a profound sense of peace, a peace he hadn't known for many years. As he watched the children playing in the distance, he reflected on how far his family had come. It was a miracle in itself. His children, once driven only by greed, had found new meaning in their lives. They were no longer defined by the wealth they had inherited, but by the good they were now doing in the world. Elizabeth, once too busy with her career to care, had found a new passion for social justice. She used her legal expertise to advocate for foster children and those in need of legal representation. Michael and Christopher, the once competitive twins, had united in their efforts to bring medical care to underserved communities. Sarah, the artist, had founded a nonprofit that provided art education to children in impoverished areas. And Thomas, the youngest, had left behind the world of finance to focus on ethical investing and social entrepreneurship. Edward had watched in awe as each of them, in their own way, took the lessons he had taught them and applied them to the world around them. He had always hoped for this kind of change, but never had he believed it would come in such a profound and meaningful way. The wealth that had once driven them apart had now brought them together in ways he could never have imagined. 5 years later, Oakwood Manor was unrecognizable from its former days. The grand house was still there, but it had been repurposed into spaces that reflected the new mission of the Blackwell family. William and Alexa, now raising their own children in the estate, had created a new generation that would continue to honor the lessons of love, compassion, and community. Edward had become a beloved figure in the community, his legacy secure not in the riches he had once hoarded, but in the love and goodwill he had inspired. As he watched William and Alexa play with their children in the garden, Edward knew that his legacy was secure, not because of the fortune he had built, but because of the lives he had touched. His wealth had not disappeared. It had been transformed into something far more meaningful. It had created opportunities, nurtured dreams, and built a future based on the values that truly mattered. In the quiet moments before dusk, Edward smiled to himself, knowing that his story had come full circle. His wealth had been a test, a catalyst for change, and now it had become a symbol of everything that was truly important: family, love, and the desire to make the world a better place. This was the true legacy of Edward Blackwell, a legacy that would endure for generations to come. The Blackwell fortune was no longer about material wealth. It was about the wealth of the heart, the legacy of compassion, and the bonds of family that transcended money. And in this, Edward Blackwell had found the peace he had spent a lifetime searching for. His legacy would never be forgotten. Not in dollars, but in the hearts of those who would carry his lessons into the future. If you enjoyed this heartfelt story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more amazing tales. Your support keeps us going,